Okay, good morning, everyone. You're very welcome to our webinar this morning. My name is Aoife Smith and I'm your moderator for today. Myself and my colleague Declan Phelan, who's helping me with the technical support this morning, so hopefully this goes off without a hitch. We're part of a consortium team at the National Rural Network, otherwise known as the NRN. For anyone who is unaware, we are led by Irish Rural Link, and we are a consortium with the team NUIG and then ourselves at Philip Farley and Company. We are funded through the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine underneath the Rural Development Programme, and our main objective is to build and sustain a membership-based network where we disseminate key information on the fundings available under the Rural Development Programme. So just before we kick off this webinar, just to let you all know, it will be recorded and will be available on our NRN YouTube channel and shared on our social media networks over the next few days. I'd also like to encourage you to use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions that you may have throughout the two presentations that we have for you here this morning. My colleague Declan there will monitor the questions that you're posing and we'll ask them to our speakers after the two presentations. So as you all know, this morning's webinar is titled Sequestering Carbon, Irish Soils and Practical Measures. Biodiversity loss and climate change are two very pressing challenges that we face. The soil, its biodiversity, its capacity to store and release carbon, and how we manage it are all very important aspects which we'll try and touch on today. We have two very excellent speakers who we're delighted to help us with the presentation this morning. So we're going to have a researcher's perspective. So Lillian O'Sullivan is there from Teagasc, and the farmer's perspective. We have Walter Furlong there as well. So you're all very welcome here this morning. Lillian, you're first up this morning with your presentation. I'll just do a brief introduction while you're getting set up. Lillian is a research officer in the Environment of Soils and Land Use Department of Teagasc, based in Johnstown Castle, County Wexford. Her research interests include sustainable soils land use and understanding how soils are part of a larger system. And I won't do you any justice by saying much more, so I'll let you take over there, Lillian. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Aoife. Just to check, you can hear me okay, Aoife? And see my screen?
Yeah, perfect. That's ready to go.
Wonderful. Great. Okay. So as Aoife mentioned, I'm a research officer with Teagasc. I'm based in Wexford, as she said, in the Environment, Soils and Land Use Department. So today I'm going to talk a bit about some of the carbon research that we have ongoing. Very much what I'm showing today is the work of many of my colleagues, and also we have more extended presentations available if you want to look up our Teagasc research insights link on our Teagasc website. But okay, we'll go ahead and we'll dive straight in. I think it's important to just start and touch on why is this whole topic of soil organic carbon really important and more important. But of course, the main reason is that we know it can enhance carbon sinks because it can directly remove carbon dioxide from our atmosphere. It can store it in soil or woody biomass. And this is really, I suppose, one of the more important things from a societal perspective, the role of soil as a carbon sink. But of course, soils can be a sink, but they can also be a source dependent upon management. Soil organic carbon, it also allows for better retention of ammonium N, potassium, calcium. So it's very important too from a soil health and fertility perspective. It also keeps phosphorus available at high and low pH. And it reduces bulk density. So we know in Ireland, one of the key threats to soils is compaction associated with the management regime. But of course, if you manage your soil organic carbon, it can help, retain a more optimal bulk density, limit that compaction, which can in turn limit environmental losses associated with runoff. And it also improves soil water holding capacity. So altogether, soil organic carbon, it's really important from a soil health perspective, but also too more and more from its climate regulation potential. So I thought it was pertinent to start maybe by just having this graph, which is effectively, the carbon cycle, but the whole basis centers around photosynthesis that draws carbon dioxide from the atmosphere that's utilized then to grow biomass in our trees, our crops and grass, etc. But of course, these are living, so they too respire some of that carbon they take in back to the atmosphere. But we also have roots and litter fall that are incorporated back into the system. But then too in the soil, we have microbes that also respire and release carbon dioxide back out to the atmosphere. So then when we think that we also have some carbon that's leached down out of the system, and when we consider some of the crop offtakes and the biomass that's taken away, essentially what's left in the soil is the carbon that's sequestered. And as a rule of thumb, that's estimated to be about 10% of what's taken in. So ecosystems that sequester more than they emit, those are carbon sinks, whereas those that can release or do release are called our carbon sources. And I just wanted to mention that on balance, our grasslands, even though our mineral grasslands are, have capacity to be sinks, because we have a proportion of organic, high carbon soils that have been drained for agriculture. On balance, those are offsetting the sink potential of the mineral ones. So that's something we'll come to a bit more shortly. But altogether, I suppose the main point is that carbon sequestration can help us to balance our greenhouse gas emissions. And we have already in Teagasc put out there our marginal abatement cost curve. And what that is essentially a graph that allows us to see the abatement potential of different measures. So you have the different measures, what they can save in terms of emissions set against what they cost. So here we have the land use carbon sequestration MAC. And we see, of course, forestry is our main mitigation from a land use perspective measure currently, with about 2.1 megatons of CO2 equivalent. But of course, we know in arable systems, cover crops, straw incorporation, they also can generate some savings, but are more expensive, whereas the pasture management measures in the MAC are cost beneficial because they're below the zero. And then there's also scope to manage organic soils through water table management. But often people are saying, well, how much is it? But it's important to mention that it's actually very difficult to measure carbon sequestration. So it's something we as researchers are working and trying to refine methods in the space the whole time. But really what's happening in the soil is you have a very small input to a very large background. So if you add a half a ton, for example, to a hectare that already has a couple of hundred tons of carbon, then that's very difficult to see that accumulate, and it takes a very long time to build up. So this makes it very hard to measure on an annual ongoing basis. So then how are we measuring it, or what are the different ways that we can measure it and are doing through our work? Of course, because it does take a long time, one of the things that's important to have is long-term experiments, and we need these so that we can assess over a longer time period how managements affect the balance of carbon in the soil. So you'll have a baseline carbon and it gets to an equilibrium, but then you introduce a management change, which brings you to point B, and over time a new equilibrium is established. And in this instance here, we see that this management has had a positive effect, and this difference here is the sequestration that can be accounted for in the inventories. But of course, that's reversible. It's very slow often, and it needs to actually be established for the same and different soil types across different land uses and management regimes. But then we also have our Eddy covariance towers, and these, unlike the long-term experiments, can give you an annual estimate. So these are towers. They use sensors to measure the greenhouse gas fluxes. So eddies are gas bubbles. They move through the atmosphere, and as the gas changes, it changes the eddy and the concentrations of the gases, and the sensor picks this up, and over time then this allows us to be able to improve our estimates of the carbon sequestration under different soil types and farm managements. And more recently we have our National Agricultural Soil Observatory, or NASCO, is currently being rolled out, which will allow us to put some more towers around the country and allow us to be able to try and measure across different scenarios. And then of course we have controlled experiments. Here at the bottom you see an example of an experiment in Johnstown Castle where you apply a distinct label on the carbon, and this can be followed right through the system. So how much of it is taken up in the plant, how much is being respired, what's happening in the soil, and the fate of all of this, and it can be measured at different stages, and it isolates what's happening to that carbon as opposed to the whole pool. So it really can help advance your understanding of what's happening to carbon as part of the system. But it's also the case, and important to mention, that not all carbon is the same. So different carbon pools in the soil, they have different biological stability, decomposition rate, and turnover time. So what we have is we've carbon that's very unprotected. It's very labile, which means it's very free moving. It can be readily mineralized by biology in the soil, but it's very labile and can turn over quickly in a period of maybe weeks, years. And on the one hand, this is a really good indication of biological fertility because there's good nutrient turnover. It's also quite readily lost as CO2 back to the atmosphere. So, however, as organic matter keeps getting broken down, what we see is that it becomes more protected the longer it stays in the system. And so what you can have is carbon that becomes more physiochemically protected. So it's associated to smaller particles in the soil, and it's more difficult for microbes to break down, until ultimately you get a chemically protected carbon that is very difficult for microbes to break down, and that is really truly sequestered carbon. So if you have a soil and they have, if you have two soils and they have the same organic matter, but one has more recalcitrant, so a more protected carbon, while it's less fertile, it has lower bioavailability, so it's less available for microbes. However, it has a higher mean residence time of carbon, so it's a much more stable, protected carbon. And so this is these are the important considerations when we're thinking of climate mitigation and soil fertility and so forth. And we have looked at that. So where is the carbon stored? And what we do see is that indeed most of the carbon is in the topsoil, this top 30 centimeters, and it's associated with these bigger aggregated soil sizes. So going from small to large, we see most of that carbon is in the topsoil, and that's the level that's measured for inventories and so forth. However, what's also very interesting is that we found is that we have this more protected carbon at depth. We have brown earths that have quite a lot of carbon at depth, but also then we have this very protected carbon associated with these smaller aggregate sizes, which makes them more physically protected, so they can be a longer term sink for carbon sequestration in subsoils. So while it's a smaller pool, it has a lot more protective capacity. And of course, while that 30 centimeters depth is interesting in terms of capturing the magnitude, it doesn't actually capture the quality or the residence time from a climate mitigation perspective. Also, just to say, we have also developed a harmonized classification of Irish soils. And here what you see are 3 graphs that show soil organic carbon, their spatial distribution and their variation. And what we see is that in mineral soils, we have about 1,800 megatons, which is million tons of CO2 equivalent. We also looked at what that pool at depth represents, and that represents about 253 megatons at national scale. And I suppose when you pitch that against the context of a whole, our whole of sector, or not sector, but our total annual emissions for Ireland are about 60 megatons of CO2 equivalent. So really there is a challenge there to, I suppose, protect those, but also think about ways that we can enhance those carbon pools at depth. So while I've spoken a bit there about mineral soils, it's also true that we have a very important carbon stock in our peat soil. So we have in Ireland about 20 to 25% almost of peat soils, but we did do a study where we looked at what is the role of artificially drained agricultural land for those very carbon rich soils. And what we see is that when we model this, that we have somewhere around 300 plus thousand hectares of peat, so soils with greater than 20% organic carbon, and those represent an annual emission source of about 8.7 megatons of CO2 equivalent. We also have peaty minerals, which are mineral soils that have a peaty top layer, and those two have a substantial loss. But I suppose, you know, if we think about what can we do, is there something we can do in terms of managing water table? Can we make some savings? And we just simulated a modeling exercise, and annual savings were estimated if you re-wet half of those drained peats, savings were estimated at 3.2 megatons of CO2 equivalent. So then if we start to think about translating that more in the direction of management, what we're talking about really is needing to take a spatially targeted approach to managing soil or organic carbon, and thinking about the types of soils that we have on our farm. So if we have peaty organic soils, they have greater than 20% carbon, those are really important carbon stock, and if oxygen is introduced to that, then they can represent serious losses and offset, as we mentioned earlier, the benefits of mineral grasslands, for example. We also have mineral where mineral soils, so much lower carbon content. And then we have our humic soils, which are where we see over time a humic or peaty layer has accumulated at the surface. So in terms of our land uses, most of our cropland, of course, is on mineral soils, which tend to show about 1 to 4% soil organic carbon. Grasslands, mineral grasslands, 2 to 7%. And then, of course, our peat soils are anywhere up to 50% soil organic carbon in a very fibrous peat. But we know, of course, that sandy soils, so if you think in terms of our texture, they've lower capacity to hold carbon compared to higher clay content soils. And of course, water table alteration and introduction of oxygen is going to be really crucial in determining the balance of carbon in soils. So we've also looked at the potential for sequestration in subsoil in our square project below 30 centimeters. And here you see those 3 different soil categories. And what we see is that they all have considerable capacity to store soils at depth. but these poorly drained soils, of course, they're more affected by soil compaction, which can impede their rooting depth. Now, if we think that rooting depth is a mechanism to draw down more carbon to deeper layers, these soils need particular management, because those are also the soils that have greater capacity to protect carbon in the soils. But all of that hinges, of course, on careful management and limiting soil compaction. But how can we protect then also soil carbon levels? So we also have a long-term experiment here. You see a study in Knockbeg, Oak Park, where we looked at soil organic carbon over a long time series. And as you can see, we had a grassland that was converted to a cropland. And what we see, of course, is that immediate fall off. But then we started to look at different managements, such as reduced till and straw. And what you can see is that over time, the treatments begin to enhance carbon levels and potentially carbon sequestration over time. Another experiment is a long-term experiment that's been initiated to look at grassland reseeding methods. Here are 3 different reseeding, no-till or stitching versus conventional ploughing to 20 centimetres or deep ploughing to 40 centimetres. Now, of course, you might ask, why would you deep plough if you potentially turn down your fertility? But we wanted to explore, I suppose, what happens if you can pump carbon further down to where it's less exposed to losses, and can we enhance longer term storage in soils? There's also experiments ongoing looking at monograss, multi-species that have deeper rooting, where it might be less exposed to the oxygen layer, and then again in turn have more potential for longer term storage. So these are just a few of some of the ongoing experiments, but we also are looking at things like hedgerows. So we have another experiment ongoing. People often say, oh, well, what about our hedgerows? Because of course, hedgerows are an important element on our landscapes. We know that they occupy, 680,000 kilometers. But what we want to do in this experiment for the first time is to take some direct measurements so that we can relate a biomass volume. So a volume is calculated using a remote measurement. Can we relate that then to a carbon stock? Because people say, well, how can we look at this for inventories and different things, but we cannot do that unless we have methodologies that allow us to assess carbon stock changes over time. So of course, this is trying to move in that direction. That work is ongoing, and currently we're at laboratory analysis stage with that. So then just finally, I suppose, in terms of the work from this research, where we look at land use and management, over time with, I suppose, an expansion of the work that's ongoing now, the aim is to be able to estimate the capacity of Irish soils to sequester carbon. So we know quite a bit about that, but there's still a lot to be understood there, but also then to quantify the impacts of management strategies on carbon sequestration in mineral soils. Also, what are the strategies that could help us to reduce losses from managed peat soils? And then what kind of data can we use or develop to model the impact of carbon management in terms of our greenhouse gas emissions? And of course, all of this is to help us support the generation of verified results in terms of our carbon accounting in agricultural soils. Okay, so that was very much a whistle-stop tour. Wanted to try, I suppose, to give a little bit of the scientific background and just, I suppose, some of the insights into some of the ongoing research. And I'm happy to take questions. Well, I know we'll be doing that at the end, but I'll pass you back now to Aoife, and thank you.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant, Lillian. That's absolutely excellent. It's very informative and a wealth of information there. I know it's just the tip of the iceberg for the knowledge and the research that you're involved in. So hopefully we can address and explore that a little bit further in the questions after this. So now I'd like to introduce you to our second speaker, Walter Furlong. Walter is a very busy farmer. He graduated with a bachelor's business degree from Dublin Business School and has completed his Green Cert from Kildalton College. He manages over 4,000 acres in Cayman, County Wexford of tillage ground. And he also works within the Cooney Furlong Grain Company, where he's trading and hedging grain. So I don't want to mess up your introduction, Walter, because I don't want to not give you as much justice as you deserve. But I think Declan is going to share your presentation, so you can get going on that, Walter. That's brilliant. Thank you.
Thanks, Aoife. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I've just been asked to do a presentation on our approach to sustainable farming and cover cropping here in Wexford. I'll just start with just kind of an introduction to Cooney Furlong target and Wildflower Furlong grain, and then I'll move on to what we're doing here on the farm. Next slide, please, Declan. So there's kind of three companies operating out of the one spot here in Came. There's Cooney Furlong, Target Fertilizers, and Wildflower Furlong grain. Cooney Furlong was founded in '98 with Kevin Cooney and my father Walter. And over the years, it's just a merchant company. So over the years, we've grown into having three kind of retail branches selling feed, fert, chemicals, dosing, Welton's hardware, that kind of stuff. And then obviously dealing with farmers on the retail sense on seed and fert and all the rest of it around Wexford. We supply Diageo and IDL and these companies with food grade barley, and then obviously take in and dry various types of crops all around Wexford. Target Fertilizers was then also founded in 1998 with Kevin, Walter, and John Grennan. So it's grew since '98 to about 20 to 22% of the Irish market, wholesale into merchants and co-ops all over Ireland. So you know yourself, it's just general all kind of fertilizers across Ireland. And then what's left is the farm. So my father started farming here in '78, starting out with roughly about 100 acres, and we're now up to 4,200 odd acres around the Wexford area, in about 35 kilometers of home here. We're growing a range of crops: wheat, barley, oats, rape, beans, rye. But it's kind of a 50-50 kind of thing. So 50% spring crops, 50% winter crops. If you move on to the next slide there now, please, Declan. And that's just kind of during the harvest here in Cooney Furlong. We have plenty of barley coming in at us, so kind of mountains of it really. Next slide, please, Declan. And that's just some of the storage units here in Cooney Furlong. Next slide. That's the farms, the combines, and the spreaders and stuff. Next slide. Once again, the farm, fertilizer. Now you can keep going, Declan. Now, when we started min tilling in 1999. We were ploughing up until then, and we decided to go down the mill till route. For the first, you could say 5-6 years, my father was saying that they struggled big time with it, with various different reasons. There were initially we were grubbing too light. We were grubbing or cultivating, I should say. We kind of say grubbing down here, but kind of at 2 and 3 inches. And what was happening was we'd sow the corn, whether it be winter or spring, and we get this slap of rain. It was kind of game over. So we actually bought a Valstad top down around, I think it was 03 or 02, and that kind of revolutionized the tilling, because we were able to go down deeper, down to we're tilling anywhere from now till 4 to 6 inches, which allowed for the water. But we were still running into the problem that on our spring barley ground, because we're predominantly spring barley, we're growing about anywhere from 1,800 acres to 1,700 to 1,900 acres of spring barley a year for food grade, for malting and stuff. So we were running into the problems of the kind of ground getting spun out. It was on light ground, and it was just the ground was just getting shook. Like, so we went in with a mustard cover crop in 2004, and just trying it in a few places, just these big crops of mustard act as a break crop nearly for our spring barley the following season. Now, since then, the system actually hasn't changed that much. We were chopping all our straw back then. And now with around, I think it was around 09 or 10, we started baling again. It was just because, look, the money started coming back into straw. And that has kind of affected the system slightly, because back then we were only sowing kind of single variety cover crops, and now we're up to 7-way mixes and 5-way mixes and 4-way mixes. But the straw is kind of a hindrance to a degree when it comes to cover cropping, because you're cutting whenever at the end of July, early August, and you're trying to get this straw bale, and everyone knows that baling straw is not simple in this country. So it's kind of, you might lose a week when you should be sowing cover crops basically with the straw. But it's something people always argue with us that, you know, if you chop the straw, you'll be adding back organic matter and stuff. But we kind of make the argument that our cover crops are doing that for us. But I'll get to that soon. Next slide, please, Declan. Now, seed selection is kind of, we've done an awful lot of work with Journal, Ireland, and Robbie Burns and these kind of people around the country on cover crops. And the main reason we kind of got into cover crops, like I said, was to kind of act as a break. But when we started doing, Philip, our late colleague Philip, was kind of the lead research honor from here. Like, we kind of, like, cover crops kind of bind the roots together and mop up a lot of nutrients in the soil. These nutrients then grow the cover crop for you during the winter. So it'll grow biomass above the ground and below the ground. Through the process of photosynthesis, the sunlight is converted, and it creates energy in the cover crops, which runs sugar, kind of these sugars down into the roots. And these sugars are excreted as exudates, and soil biology in the land then feeds on these exudates. So when you kind of turn over our soil now, you see this kind of vibrant soil. It's nearly alive, like, and that's through these sugars. Now, that's the kind of scientific approach that people will talk about. But when we started looking at, we were just doing, say, mustard, but mustard is kind of, when you sow a single crop of mustard, it's very hard to get rid of. It can be very stringy, and it can be very tough to desiccate in the spring. So we started working with Journal, and we started using the likes of Phacelia and tillage radish, clover, vetch, buckwheat, leafy turnip, forage rape, and these kind of things. Now, they all have their own benefits, and that's kind of why it's so important to kind of do a bigger mix, because it's kind of like if you're a worm or a fungi or whatever in the soil, like, you'll get fed up eating mustard all day every day. You kind of want, it's like eating chips every day of the week. You want to have something different. Like, so we did a lot of research in America about this and talked to people over there. So we were starting to use, say, the likes of a tillage radish. So if you see tillage radish, it's a big long taproot, but it also has a lot of biomass above the ground. But the taproot goes right down. We don't even know how deep it goes, because you can never get to the end of it. And it's a big, massive, there could be 3 or 4 inches of a root in it. And it breaks the pan, any pans or any compaction issues. But what also it does is it'll let the water run the whole way down the root. So there's none of this issues with water standing on fields or anything like that. Phacelia is the other one. That's a massive one for us, them two in particular, because Phacelia grows very quickly and very aggressively, and it creates a lot of biomass again. But its root system is very fibrous, and it kind of spreads out. And what it does is it tills the top 3 or 4 inches of the ground. It makes the ground very friable and a great tilt, and it's great to get going. Then you have the likes of vetches, which are legumes to fix nitrogen over the winter. We've been using hairy vetch, the new one we use now, because it's more winter tolerant. The frost doesn't kill it as quick. Buckwheat was another one that we use for scavenging phosphorus. So to say that buckwheat will capture phosphorus, but actually and return it to the soil and make it available. What else do we have? we've gone back to using mustard. We stopped using mustard for years because of issues killing it. And we found out lately about, well, a year and a half ago, that research in America has shown that mustard actually biofumigates the soil and can actually kill. Brassicas in general do that, but mustard is leading the pack. And what it does is it'll kill soil pathogens like Fusarium. And Fusarium was the one we were very interested in, because down here in Wexford, not this harvest now, but last harvest, on the intakes here around Wexford for ourselves, and we were noticing we had big Fusarium problems, and there was an awful lot of barley here rejected for malt on Fusarium issues. So we started introducing, this year we introduced mustard again to hopefully combat this slightly. We've used peas before. We've sowed, we spread them before. We used a spreader actually to spread them out, because you couldn't meter them out with the biodrill. And I think we got our biggest yield of spring barley after that, because they fixed so much nitrogen. We got sorted actually after winter barley, and then we just peas and then Phacelia, radish, vetch, a bunch of stuff. And I think we did over 4 ton on spring barley in that area. It was about 300 acres on that area of ground the following spring. So basically what we're saying is it's mixing and matching the cover crops to kind of get the best of attributes of each. Like we have a 7-way magic mix now with radish, Phacelia, vetch, a clover, there's buckwheat in it, there's a bunch of stuff in it. Like, so it's all about kind of working that way. And like the likes of German and these people are doing a lot of work on new varieties and new attributes to each of these things. And winter hardiness is the biggest one. Vigor and winter hardiness is what we were looking for. Like, you know, we want a cover crop to get up and going, because the way the harvests are going now, we're getting later and later sown these cover crops. So like last year we didn't have great cover crops, but this year we're very good, because we kind of wiped it out with kind of the end of August and early September. But we're always looking for crops to kind of jump up and go, because it is an issue in Ireland that you're coming into a hardy winter that you're dying off a bit quick. The other side of cover crops is what you'll see is you'll see kind of retain moisture. Now you might think that sounds strange, but if you see on tillage ground here in Wexford, and it happens around the country, when you get into the spring and you sow your first block of land and you're getting to your last 100 acres or 300 acres or 400 acres, and even when the crops you have sowed, you can see this issue of land starting to dry out. And on spring crops, germination is so important to get them up and going, that retained moisture is actually very important toward the end of the spring. So what the cover crops tend to do is that, since the soil is kind of how would you say, like it's just that bit more lively or something, it holds the moisture. The roots that are left over from the cover crop hold the moisture in place, that gets you out and it gets the crop kind of up and away quicker, because it has the moisture. Now what you'll say is that sometimes when you go in and start tilling first with the cover crops, you'll know that it is a bit damper. Like lads around here probably get going 2 days earlier than we do, but in the end it kind of works out better for us. Next slide please, Declan. So you'll just see some of this here, like on the left there and the right, is what you kind of see is these it's kind of like treadlock roots, and they say that's a sign of actual soil building. It's humus building in the soil, and they're microbes and stuff locking on, and it's actually building humus in the soil. So that's what the science is telling us. Next slide. So there's just an example of cover crop we've sown on the right there, and on the left, kind of there's about 2 weeks in the difference there this year. So we're pretty happy this year with what we're seeing. Next slide. And there's an example of a tillage radish on the left there now. So you see it, like that's not just the length of it, because there's this tiny taproot that goes on the whole way down through it. So as you can see, there's plenty of biomass below the ground and above the ground. So they're kind of a fundamental part of cover crops in this country, really. So next slide. Sowing. Now I think this is the be all and end all of cover crops. Like you can talk about the humus and the fungi and the mycorrhizae and stuff, but you won't get any of that benefit if it's not sown correctly. And I think that's an issue that a lot of farmers in this country run into. They deem the cover crop a glass payment or whatever, throw it in there and forget about it, like, and then they're giving out then that it's not growing or it's not doing this. We find we use 3 different tools to do it. We use either the Vaderstad top down that you see that's parked on the quad track there. We use a Vaderstad carrier. I don't have a photo of that there now, but or we use a Vaderstad spirit drill. Now, I don't really like using the drill to do it because it's just kind of rough on the drills going in on stubble ground, but the top down and the carrier are the best tools for it. We find generally the top down is the best because with straw, if you get, say, like if the weather breaks during the harvest and you're cutting spring barley and you've, say we have 1,000 acres cut, we've another 1,000 to go or something, the machines come back on the land after the weather lifts. The machines are now back on the land and they're kind of they're compacting the land a bit. The lads baling with the trailers and the transstackers and the loaders, they're compacting the land a bit. So sometimes the land can come a bit hard and the discs kind of tend to not get enough tilt to get the cover crop going. So we find sometimes the top down is nearly the best tool for it, but the disc will cover more ground. So it's all dependent on the farm and conditions. But the other very important side to someone is you have to roll it. We roll every cover crop that we sow because they're all tiny seeds. If you look at if you could open a bag of cover crop seed, like the seeds are absolutely minuscule. So seed soil contact in order to get it going is very important. And especially when you're getting later in the season, you need it even more. So we'd have a guy here rolling constantly after sowing the cover crops. There's a lot of guys around here before they go cutting will go roll for an hour or two just to keep ahead of it. Like, so I genuinely think that's the biggest problem in the country is that they're not being sown right. And I think they need to invest in their equipment to sow. So whether it be, I think the idea of, like, I know I said I spread out the peas, but we came afterwards with a disc and basically till the peas in, whereas a lot of guys spread it out and then roll it in. And some years, the likes of this year, that was fine. But I think 9 times out of 10, if you really want a top quality cover crop, you need to get that little bit of tilt, that 2 or 3 inches on top of the ground, just to get the vigor going. So I think that's the main point to focus on when it comes to cover crops. Next slide, please. Management. So another kind of thing that some guys, we have a lot of guys around here in County Furlong, we get them to do it. We, after the cover crop is established and the volunteers are up, we spray them all off with Falcon or whatever brand you may have. And people might think that sounds strange because you're spraying again, but there's a couple of reasons for doing it. We first of all, the volunteers will outcompete the cover crop if you have what you call Schumacher combine drivers, which we have 4 of them down here. So you kind of you can end up having these just streams of volunteers, like, and no cover crop, and that's not what you're wanting. So that's the number 1 reason for doing it. You're also breaking a disease cycle. So by having volunteers carrying the hoe into the spring, you have this disease cycle. So you're constantly breaking that. You're increasing your chances of getting more disease in the barley next year. The Falcon will get a lot of weeds. It's not hectic on a lot of weeds, but it'll still take out some of them. So you're just treating it like you're growing barley, like you're looking after, and you're getting a bigger cover crop. Falcon is not dear to do, or any of those kind of sprays aren't overly expensive. So it's paramount to us on our cover crop thing, because you will end up kind of with weaker cover crops if you don't do it. So it's very important to us. Next slide, please. The destruction of cover crops. Now, there's two ways of doing it. There's spraying it off with glyphosate. We use about 0.5 kg or 1 kg of Power Max, and depending on the year or how quick we want to kill it. And then the other option is going out and rolling it in the frost. Now, say the likes of the last 2 or 3 days here, we will have a certain amount of kill off. Like the buckwheat will all die now with that frost. The buckwheat can't stick frost. There's plenty of other varieties are not hectic on frost. It won't kill them instantly, but some of the varieties that you sow will naturally be dead by January or end of February, say. Then you have to go out and spray off with with Roundup, but you can also go rolling in the frost. So you basically snap the stem and the frost kills the cover crops. Now that does involve getting up at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning to go rolling, and it's not always exactly practical, but it is a way of doing it as well. And you can see on the right hand side there, that's one of the nights we did go rolling, and you can see how it's after rolling in. And then people always ask us, like, what about residues and stuff? If you look like that, where that's till there on the left hand side in that photo, like, we had a monstrous cover crop there, and it's gone within a week or two. Like, in terms of grazing, I'm no nutritionist, or I'm not a cow or cattle expert by any stretch of imagination, but a lot of guys sow cover crops around here for grazing. Now, you can't use some varieties. You have to just specify what varieties you want for grazing, but companies like us sell grazing specific varieties. The only thing I'll say with grazing is not to overgraze it, because one of the key components to cover crops is protecting the soil over the winter. So basically acting as a shield, because they say that rainwater hits the soil at 50 or 60 miles an hour or something crazy. I think it could even be higher. And what you will notice is that if you have a field, say a cover crops and a stubble field, the stubble field will slump. The soil will actually compact itself on top of the ground. And when you go into till in the spring, you'll get this lumpy soil because the rain is after hammering it all winter. Whereas the cover crops will protect the soil and keep it fluff, basically, like fluff. So if you are grazing it, don't leave the cattle or whatever you have on it too long and wipe out the cover crop, because you'll just end up with this, they'll cap it and it'll come back, it'll till up muddy, like, if you know what I mean. The importance of glyphosate, this system can't really work without glyphosate, and I think the Americans are arguing that strongly, because cover crops are becoming a massive thing over there due to soil erosion more so than anything. It'd be very difficult to do this system without it. So I think as terms of anyone who's lobbying or talking to people about glyphosate and stuff, I think it's in order to farm environmentally friendly, the way we're doing it, which I think is environmentally friendly. I hope it's environmentally friendly. Glyphosate is an extremely important tool in that system. So next slide, please, Declan. Fertilizer savings. You might find it funny that I'm talking about fertilizer savings considering targets here, but we've probably cut back on nitrogen on the farm 10 to 15 units roughly, given where it is or what we're doing. That's like a can this year. That's probably €25 a unit roughly this year. So we're seeing major benefits in that. On our indexes just seem to just grow quicker, if you know what I mean. We're nearly index 4 on all our spring barley ground now, and that's because the nutrient retention, the organic matter is increasing, and it's just the nutrients being withheld in the soil. So we've cut back on potash. I think we cut back, what did we do? I think it was 30 units last year. So we're seeing massive savings on fertilizer. Now, bearing in mind, this is over a 15-year period. It's not going to happen overnight. But like it's happening. Pesticide savings is another thing. Like it's to do with the breaking the cycles. So with cover crops, you're bringing in natural predators. I wouldn't go as far as saying we're cutting on pesticides. We're definitely not seeing an issue with pesticides ever, or pests on the farm, because we've natural predators hanging around after the cover crops, and we're breaking the cycle. If you just keep sowing spring barley or keep sowing whatever spring crops, you'll have this monoculture, and they say that the more monoculture you have, the more issues with resistance and stuff you're going to have. Same with the grass weeds. We're hitting them twice, once with the Falcon and then with the Roundup at the end. So I can't remember the last time we had a weed situation where we, like, our weed problems are never bad in the spring. Metal and diesel. Metal, in terms of metal, we are getting thousands of acres out of hips. Not thousands of acres, but we're getting way longer than we used to out of any of the tips we have on our top down. And what we notice a lot is with diesel. So if we have a new farm, like I noticed this spring, we had a new farm that we got last year or 2 years ago that we only had, say, cover crops in it for 2 years, and I went to a farm then literally about 15 minutes down the road that we didn't, and the difference in the tractor is about 1 kilometer, like on the quad track. Like they're just run, the top down will just, the quad track just run away with the top down in the cover crop soil that's been in cover crops for for 15 years. The ground is just more friable around the gates, everything. She's just burning way less diesel when she's in that ground. When she's in kind of relatively new ground, there's more of a pull. I don't have trials on it. It's not scientific. It's just I know from sitting on the tractor that's what we see. We're definitely massive diesel savings. Next slide, please, Declan. So if you look at this, like on the right, there's a sign of the kind of the fungi in the soil and the clubby roots. That's all in relation to the cover crops. The spade in the middle just shows you that tilt. That's the Phacelia working. That's the Phacelia creating that kind of powder on top. Just a real friable soil. And the big ignorant boat on the left, that's about that's about 3 weeks ago. I remember in the end of November, or maybe it was the end of October, we got this 2 or 3 days of torrential rain. It's like 3 or 4 inches or whatever it was. I went down to one of our cover crops, one of the cover crops that was sown after winter barley, and it's on kind of South Wexford soils, which I know everyone says like that, we're on loamy soils down here, but South Wexford will be a little bit heavier. And I walked across the field. I went maybe 400 or 500 yards and back. After raining for 3 days solid, ground was still saturated, and I came back, and that was what was on me on the bottom of my boat. No clay, because the water is just getting away. The water is not sitting on the field. It's not capping the soil. It's not creating muck. The water is running down through the roots, and it's filtrating basically. So it'll just show you the benefits you can have over the winter. Next slide, please, Declan. So carbon farming. I'll start with like waterways, for instance. We've just right behind me here, the field is a bit like that, and there's just the water used to run for years right down the middle of the field when we get heavy rain. We haven't seen that now, well, before my time, but we haven't seen that in about 8 or 10 years because we've been sowing constant cover crops up there. And at the bottom here, there's a drain. The water used to come out really dirty and clay. So obviously there's all nutrients coming out in that too. That glass is from that stream after about 4 or 5 inches of rain a couple of years ago. The water was just spotless coming out of it because the cover crops is filtrating. It's not letting the roots, or it's not letting the nutrients or the clay get away. So that's a massive thing in Wexford at the minute because we've issues with nitrates in Slaney. The land going up either side of the River Slaney, Ballycarney is all in tillage ground, and there's runoff of nitrates and stuff into the water there at the minute. So we think cover crops would make a massive difference to that situation. Now, as a lot of these are probably saying, this sounds expensive, like the spraying and the cover crops and all the rest of it. What we done, Philip kind of done a carbon, what would you call it? A carbon study on the farm about 3 years ago, or 4 years ago even now at this stage. And we were given this cool farm tool to do a carbon analysis of the farm. And when we input all our figures, both winter crops and spring crops, we were actually sequestering about 982 kilos an acre of cover crops, or of carbon. So we couldn't really believe this. We were shocked by this because obviously it's great news nowadays that this is happening. So we approached Diageo with this this study that we done, and they're absolutely over the moon because obviously Diageo's one of Diageo's biggest inputs is mountain barley, is barley. So if they can buy environmentally friendly barley, that's obviously a lot better for their business. So we analysed a lot of our customers, and we've actually, Diageo have given 5 of our customers awards this year on being carbon friendly because they're doing the same system as we're doing. We are going to hopefully eventually, I'm not saying it's going to be this year or next year, get a carbon payment. Now, whether the cap will be separate to that, but hopefully, whether it be Diageo or Bort Malt or even feed mills in this country, will have to look at maybe paying extra for carbon friendly barley. That's the area we're hoping for. So whether it be a €10 a ton, €20 a ton, €30 a ton, but hopefully it'll be definitely enough to cover the cost of sowing cover crops. But even at that, like our average yields, say since 2009 are up 0.4 of a ton, or we're averaging 3.5, 3.6 ton of spring barley every year on this farm. We're not getting, in 2018 when we had the drought, we didn't get this big collapse in yields. we still averaged about 2.7 or 0.8 when everyone else was averaging 2.3 and 4 and 5. So I personally think there is still a long-term benefit to cover crops if you don't get a financial benefit, because with diesel and fertilizer savings, it all adds up. But this, hopefully, this is the way everyone's talking about trading carbon. A ton of carbon, they're saying it's worth 200. I don't know what it's worth, but I've heard €200 a ton or whatever. But the key to that is, the key for us being carbon friendly was the cover crops and mint hill. We've we just fiddled around with figures for ages and put in different stuff and put in ploughing and all the rest of it. And if we're ploughing, we're not carbon neutral, or carbon sinkish, as I say. We're so the fundamental part of that plan was mint hill and cover crops. So that's kind of where we see it going. Like, I think tillage farming is actually in the driving seat when it comes to the environmental thing, because with this kind of stuff we can be carbon friendly. You know, like, everyone, the agriculture is under the microscope now at the minute, so we kind of have to be seen to be doing something. Like, we can't wait for legislation or government stuff. We kind of have to go out and do it ourselves. Like, if you look there on the right is beehives. We get farmers to bring in beehives around the rate just for pollinators and stuff. If you go to the next slide, Declan. Oh yeah, sorry, I'll go on to, there's Terracan at the bottom of that. I'll get to Terracan at the end. But this is organic matter improvements on our farms and so on. And I think this is the other side of cover crops, and this is the other side why we're sequestering carbon, is because our organic matter have grown so much. We soil sampled the whole place in 2009. Well, a lot of places, but we just took out these couple of fields, and then we did it again in 21. And as you can see, the improvement in organic matter is absolutely massive, anywhere from 55% up to 75%. You know, you were told in college that you could only increase organic matter by 1% over 40 years. This is solely down to cover crops. We don't import any slurry. We don't import any dung. It's all cover crops, continuous cover crops for 15 years, basically. And these aren't, the other side of it is, these aren't heavy soils. Like, these, if you look at, say, the Slate field, that's a shale field. There's only literally top of the lane here. It's very, very light ground, and that's after growing 58%. And they say it's very difficult to grow organic matter in light ground. So this was a big revelation to us as well. And, you know, we always hear that import slurry, import farmyard dung, and do if you can. But around here, a lot of the time, it's not practical. It doesn't work. The slurry comes in the middle of January and destroys the whole place, so the slurry's not that good. A lot of the times you'll do more damage spreading it with machinery and stuff, as you will. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but I'm saying it's not that practical. Whereas cover crops will be there every single July, August, September to sow. They'll always be there to be bought, sowed. So it's a continuous way to grow organic matter, in our opinion. Next slide, Declan, please. So we're doing wildflower margins. There's a lot of talk about wildflower this year with blackgrass and stuff. We didn't find any of it. I don't think Germany even found any of it when they went about it. I think it was a bit of a storm in the teacup, but we've been sowing them all around the place. And it's creating pollinators and that side of thing. But even the reaction from the public, we're under scrutiny. Everyone's under scrutiny in agriculture now from the public. We're getting a great reaction from the public about these. Like, that's great that we're doing it and makes the place look great and all the rest of it. Like, and I think that's very important. This is all a part of carbon farming. Like, this is all a part of sustainable farming. Like, say the sprayer there, we're using AgriFact 36 meter booms with low drift nozzles. So like, that's another part of GPS spreaders, automatic shut off, all that kind of stuff. This is all accounting for in these studies, and I think this is the way it's going to go in the next 3 or 4 years. I'd say more and more into this direction. I think, and I don't have a crystal ball, but that's what it's looking like at the minute. Next slide, please, Declan. This is a product that we've developed here in Target with Brandon Bioscience that we're going to use blanket across the farm this year. So basically, Brandon Bioscience are a company based in Kerry, and they formulated a biostimulant using seaweed. So basically what we do is they turn that seaweed into a liquid, and we spray it onto the fertilizer. And what this liquid does is it basically speaks to the roots, and the roots take in the nitrogen quicker, and you get 20 to 25% more efficiency out of your can. We're using it on, say, can, well, as kind of a salt can, so can with sulfur, and there's a couple of other blends there, but with the fertilizer market this year, we don't know. We'll probably just be maybe with the can. So basically that means your standard Sulcan bag is 27 units and 4 units of sulfur, give or take, different brands. You're now going down to 22 units with 3 units of sulfur and get the same effect. So it's going to be a big thing for dairy farmers, obviously, in derogation and what have you. But it will eventually, I think it will become a thing on tillage farms, because it'll come down to your carbon score. And when it comes, hopefully when it comes for payments, whether it be cap payments or private company payments, your carbon score is going to matter. So it'll have an effect on that. So basically, like I said, it's a coated seaweed, and it gives 25% more benefit out of nitrogen you're using, so you can reduce your nitrogen. So we're using a 22 unit nitrogen as opposed to 27 units. So that's your 25%. That's kind of it. I'm not telling, like, I don't want to ram our way of farming down anyone's necks. That's not the way we do it. Like, I was asked to do it, so I said I'd give a chat, and any questions, more than welcome. Thanks.
Yeah, no, that's really brilliant, Walter. Thank you very much. I thought it was very interesting, just with the cover crops there, or even on lighter soil with the water retention and the deeper rooting and stuff. I suppose, Lillian, that's probably all feeding into the carbon storage in those lighter soils, and that's why you're increasing your organic matter. So that was very insightful. Declan's going to come in there now with a few questions. I see a few coming in there. Declan.
I suppose the first one was in relation to Lillian's graph on the Mac. I don't know want to share that screen again, Lillian.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Oops.
It was just asking about the graphs on the Mac, and can you just go into a bit more detail?
Okay, yeah, sure. Okay. Sorry, I'll just put that in presenter mode there. Can you see that now?
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, okay. So what the marginal abatement cost curve represents is the abatement, or the carbon saving, if you like, associated with different measures relative to their costs. So what you see all along this x-axis, the width of the bar tells you how much saving you can get. That's shown in kilotons of CO2 equivalent. It's associated with 3 different land uses: grassland, forestry, and arable. And then the height of the bar tells you the cost. So here's straw incorporation. It's an expensive measure compared to pasture management, which is below the zero cost, which means that it's actually the measures that are included in that are cost beneficial on balance to apply. At the moment, we see, forestry as a land use mitigation option. It's in that MAC at 2.1 megatons of CO2 equivalent. So that's million metric tons at national scale. But I think it's one of those things that's worth mentioning, that replantation rates are falling off, and also we know now many of those won't be replanted that have been harvested, because they were often put on peat soils, which on balance over time are actually a net source of emissions. So of course there's a challenge there with replanting, along with other challenges that are ongoing in that sector. But effectively that's what that shows you. We also have an ammonia MAC, we also have an agricultural MAC, which shows you the different measures, a lot of them relating to animal health and EBI and different aspects. But this here is specifically in relation to land use, because of today's discussion around, I suppose, soils and carbon sequestration and so forth. Okay.
Thanks, Lillian. One or two for Walter there. Just there's a question in relation to cover crops. Are they sown before winter corn? And also, what do you kill the weeds with, or how do you manage the weeds?
It depends. We have sown cover crops before winter corn, but that's just a time scenario thing. It's, if you get the winter barley cut in the 20th of July and you have it baled, you might throw in a cover crop if you're not sown till like we sow early down here. We go pretty early because we're mint hill, so we could be sowing. Like we were finished on the 1st of October this year. Like whereas most lads did only get going on the 1st of October. So if you weren't sown to the middle of October and you got your cover crop sown the end of July, you'd have a pretty good cover crop come the start of October. So it can be done. It's just a time frame kind of thing. So yeah, it does happen, but it's not common. It's not common. And on the weeds, I presume whoever asked the question means the weeds in the cover crops, is it?
Oh yes.
Well, on the cover crops, it's Falcon, and then there's various off-brand stuff with Falcon, and then in the spring, I use Galaxy and whatever general brands there is out there, Galaxy and whatever else. But yeah, on the cover crop side, it's kind of Falcon, and there's a bunch of different names on it. I can't think of them off the top of my head.
Thank you. Lillian, I'm not sure if you've answered this privately in the Q&A, but there was a question in relation to classification defined as mask. What does that do? Do you know?
Oh yeah, sorry. So that's related to the map I showed with the carbon stock. So we were just showing in that map the mineral soil. So in mapping, if you use a mask, it's those areas that aren't being included in what you're showing. So in that instance, the peat soils all along the western seaboard were masked out, but also if you've sealed soils in urban areas, those are also part of the mask or rock outcrop, etc. So those then are just isolated out by use of a mask. That's what's used in mapping for that purpose. Okay.
There for Walter, how would management of cover crops change if Roundup and Falcon was not available?
It should be extremely difficult. Like there's no two ways about it. Like you'd have to hope for frost in a lot of senses. Like in terms of the Falcon, sometimes like there's guys around here that will use the Falcon, and there's guys who don't have a volunteer problem or mightn't have bad weeds after the harvest and they won't use it. Like so, it just depends on your situation. Like the Falcon, we find the Falcon very beneficial because you get a bigger cover crop after it. But if it was to disappear, you just have to slow down the combine a lot, and you'd have to do other approaches. But in terms of getting rid of the glyphosate, like it comes down to rolling it. Like it comes down to rolling it in the frost to kill it. There might be some, yourself now, glyphosate might disappear and something else will come along that'll kill it. So it would make the system a lot more challenging. It'd make mint till in general. That's the argument that's been had in America. I'm fairly sure that direct drilling and mint till would become a lot more difficult if they were to get rid of Roundup. And therefore, the more tilling you do, the berry grass weeds and stuff, the more carbon you release. So I think that's the argument they're making over there.
I'm not sure who the question is aimed at from Bridget there, but can you explain more about the desiccation of Vermcover in the spring? I think it could have been during your presentation, Walter. Yeah,
I'd say it's just basically the desiccation means when you come into February, we usually spray it off, depending on the weather, the end of February, and it's just basically killing the cover crop before we start sowing our spring crops. Now, like the odd year we get caught with it because you might spray it off the end of February, then you get a wet 3 weeks, like, and now you have kind of a bare soil before you go. I like going in with the grubber when it's not totally green, but because it can cause issues with dragging and stuff. I like going in when there's still a decent bit of residue there because it just means that it's been protected. So it's kind of a timing thing. Spray off around the end of February or early March, whenever, a couple of weeks before you plan on going sowing. So
perfect. And another one for you, Walter, there. As a grassland farmer, what can we learn from tillage crop rotations?
Tillage crop rotations?
Yeah.
We're rotations massive here. Like we've 680 acres of rape sown this year. It's the most we've ever sown. Last year, any of the crops we had after rape, the winter barley done 4.95 ton. Wheat knocked on the door 5 ton. Spring barley, like I said, averaging 3. We generally don't rotate the spring barley ground as much. This year now, we did a couple of blocks of spring barley ground that have been spring barley for 15 or 20 years to put rape into them. But we're just seeing massive yields. And in terms of rotation on a spring farm or on a grassland farm, are you meaning in the sense of kind of sowing break crops on your grass farm, or is it kind of different species or multi-species swords, or where is it coming from in the sense of that?
Maybe Barry, you can put another comment there.
I read that one, Walter, just as in we're focusing on tillage with your presentation, and how does that affect the grassland farmer. So I was actually just going to ask there, with multi-species then incorporated into grassland farmers with the different rooting depths and things that are involved with that, it's probably a similar scenario, and maybe in particular with mineral soils, would that be more beneficial, or what's your thoughts on that?
Definitely. I'm not an expert on multi-species now, but I was talking to Germany the other day, and there's clovers in them, and there's chicory in them, and there's all this kind of stuff in them. So it'd definitely be better for soil biology in terms of not just having one variety in the soil. So it'd have to be good for organic matter and humus, and just general soil biology on the farm would definitely have to be good for it.
Yeah. And I suppose, just if I might come in there too, I suppose they also have different, I'm neither an expert on it either, but certainly different species have different properties that lend themselves well to having adaptive capacity, I suppose, as we move forward into this, in a climate change area. There's certain species with greater rooting depth that can access more water, etc., etc. So there's quite a lot to think about there that can add value, in addition to obviously the carbon story as well.
Yeah, I suppose one thing that struck me is, you have your soil structure, your roots and everything are adding to that, and adding to the storage potential and the organic matter potential, the drainage benefits that come off that as well. And then what about compaction then in compacted soils? Is that a hindrance on sequestration potential, maybe on either tillage or grassland farms?
Well, certainly, I suppose anytime you have a compacted soil, that impedes rooting depth. So it makes it difficult for the plant to root down. So of course, then, that can, limit the potential, certainly. So of course, we are learning more and more the whole time about how to better manage compaction, and making sure of our soil conditions and not trafficking when wet, and different width tires, etc., etc. Because again, of course, that also, if you're trafficking when wet, as Walter mentioned earlier, going in, early on when the soils are too wet, potentially, what you can end up with is a scenario where you've run off into waterways and environmental losses. And of course, we neither want that environmentally, but also it's a cost. It's a loss to farmers. Certainly you want your nutrients to be, to be taken up by your plants. And obviously that's and that whole compaction, because that is obviously identified as one of the key threats to soil quality in Ireland, associated with the management regime, that's been recognised here as something we need to manage very carefully.
I know this question was asked, how far away, and I know there's a massive process with verification and all of that, with the trials and the experiments that you're involved in, but how far away are we from being able to go out on farm and measure for a particular farm of 100 acres with 5 kilometers of a hedgerow, of saying, this is your carbon storage potential in those hedgerows, or indeed the soil?
Well, I suppose already we do have, it's reasonable to say that there has been quite a lot of work done already, but the project we're involved with is for the first time taking direct measurements that allow us to validate remote measurements, and ultimately the end point of that is to be able to assess stock changes over time. But I think even though we hear large numbers in terms of extent, it's important to think or understand that stocks such as carbon are measured on a per hectare basis. So when you start to drill down to how much a hedgerow is there on a I'd have to go through the numbers in my mind again, but if you think that you know, it's quite likely I've done a back of the envelope calculation of, you know, a 60 hectare dairy farm. You're only talking about maybe reducing it to a 58 hectare. So it's not a huge amount, but it's still all part of the whole system, because it's not only from the carbon perspective. Of course, obviously hedgerows have a lot of other important benefits. But another point that was also raised in the questions is this whole area of what you do need, and you do need for inventories, you need your different carbon pools, and that's not only your above ground biomass, that's the litter inputs, that's looking at your root biomass, it's also isolating out your roots, fine roots lower than 2 millimeters. So to move in that direction is a lot of work. We already have some estimates, and what we're doing in this work now is refining those with these direct measurements, and those are currently moving through the lab, and we would expect to have that methodology hopefully published and out there in you know, summertime, I suppose, next year, towards the end of summer next year.
Brilliant, brilliant. Have we time for one more pressing question? If there's a burning one there, Declan, otherwise we'll wrap it up. I'm just conscious we said 12:15 and we're 16 now, which is great.
There's one or two questions just left on the catch crop and a different question, so I'll pose two there together. Is the rape sown and grazed in situ, or is it incorporated into the soil, Walter? And then following on from that, it takes very significant quantities of cover crop cover crop material to increase soil organic matter by 1%. What yields of fresh material per hectare are you achieving with your cover crops?
On the rape is just sold as a cash crop, so it's not for grazing. So we saw that at the end of August or middle of August, whenever, and then harvest the following July. On the fresh weight thing, we've never measured the fresh weight off it, but their studies came out actually this week, and I see it on Anglerland there during Starts Week, that Facelia was doing about 35 tonne a hectare and radish was doing about 40 tonne a hectare. That changes every year because it's all to do with how big the crop is. Like, but like as I said, we sampled our farm in 2009. We have had all these farms in continuous cover crops since then. We sampled them again in 2021, and the organic matters were up 55 to what did I say, 75%. So like, we were shocked by this. Like, we didn't expect to see this. Now, we had read in America in studies before, Philip had done a lot of research, that this was going to increase our organic matters, by the studies they had done over there and in the UK. And when we seen this increase, we were quite shocked as well. So, because we were always taught you couldn't do it either, like that it wasn't possible, but it seems that the science maybe might be changing on it. So maybe this is proof of it. But we've never went out and cut our cover crops and measured what gains on it. Like, you know, we've never done that. Perfect. Or what volume is on it.
Perfect.
Just while you're there, Aoife, I can see Walter and Lillian are answering questions in the chat as they come in as well. So if I didn't get to your question, hopefully Walter and Lillian have been answering in the background as well.
Perfect. No, that's great. Look, I'm afraid that's all we have time for today, everyone. I'd like to thank both our speakers, Lillian and Walter, for two very excellent and informative presentations, and addressing most of the questions I think that were posed. There are probably one or two more which we will go through and share with you guys, Walter and Lillian, and we can get back to whoever has posed them on that. Thank you also to my two colleagues there, James and Declan, for their technical support, and Declan's help for with the questions. If you're not already a member of the NRN, go onto our website and sign up there. It's free. You can just look it up on nationalruralnetwork.ie. And finally, thank you very much to everyone who tuned in this morning. These recordings will be made available over the coming days, and I hope you all have a lovely day. And I was trying to think earlier on if it was going to be too early to wish everyone a happy Christmas, but I decided, why not? Happy Christmas, everyone. That's great. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.